I will from time to time, but that's one reason why one might want to supplement with EPA from another source. But also EPA are found in chia seeds, in walnuts, in soybeans, and other plant-based foods. You can look these up online, and you'll immediately see that there are a lot of sources of EPA. And many of the foods that I listed off might be appetizing to you. Some of them might be unappetizing to you, or some of them you might be sort of neutral about. But it's very clear that eating foods that are rich in omega-3s and or supplementing with omega-3s to get above that 1.5 grams and ideally up to 2 or even 3 grams per day of EPA can be very beneficial for cognitive function in the short and long term. The other compound that has been shown to be directly supportive of neuronal function is phosphatidylserine, which is abundant in meats and in fish. So for those of you that do consume meat and fish, provided you're getting enough fish, you're probably getting enough phosphatidylserine. For those of you that are interested in supplementing with phosphatidylserine, it's a relatively inexpensive supplement that again is lipid-like. So it's mimicking some of the same things that you would get from food, but in higher concentration. And now after epiacids and phosphatidylserine, I would say third on the list of things that come from food that can readily support brain function would be choline. And that's because of the relationship to choline in the biosynthesis pathway for acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neuron modulator, not a neurotransmitter, but a neuron modulator in the brain. So it's kind of a electrical highlighter pen, if you will, by analogy. That is the basis of much of what we call focus, or our ability to concentrate on a particular batch of information that's coming in through our eyes, our ears, our nose, or even things that we're just thinking in our head. And not surprisingly then, many of the treatments for Alzheimer's disease, which is an inability or challenges with remembering things and focusing, are drugs that impact the acetylcholine pathway and are aimed at enhancing the amount of acetylcholine that's available to neurons. The primary source for dietary choline would be eggs, and in particular egg yolks. Eggs are an incredibly rich source of nutrients for the brain. And that's because the egg actually, if you think about it, contains all the nutrients that are required in order for an organism to grow. So if you're somebody who doesn't eat eggs or doesn't want to eat eggs, things like potatoes, nuts and seeds and grains and fruit, they don't have as much choline as eggs, but they do contain cholines. In general, most people should probably strive to get somewhere between 500 milligrams and a gram of choline per day. So 1,000 milligrams. Next on my list of compounds that have been shown in peer-reviewed research to improve neuronal and brain function is creatine. Creatine can be derived from meat sources. It can also be supplemented. Creatine can actually be used as a fuel source in the brain, and there's some evidence that it can enhance the function of certain frontal cortical circuits that feed down onto, or rather connect to areas of the brain that are involved in mood regulation and motivation. What is the threshold level of creatine to supplement in order to get the cognitive benefit? Appears to be at least 5 g per day. Now, the most typical form of creatine is so-called creatine monohydrate. Think it's interesting that creatine supplementation of 5 grams per day, that's creatine monohydrate, has been shown to improve cognition in people that aren't getting creatine from animal sources. So I personally take creatine 5 grams per day and have for a very long time. I can't say that I've noticed a tremendous benefit because I've actually never really come off it. And so I've never done the control experiment. I take it more as kind of a baseline insurance policy for me. But what I can say is that I generally consume these things like EPA, creatine alpha GPC, to set a general context of support for my neurons, for my brain. And of course, I also pay attention to the foods that contain these various compounds. So I don't actively eat additional meat just to obtain creatine. I eat a fairly limited amount of meat. I don't restrict it, but I do eat meat, but I don't actively seek out creatine in my diet. Rather, I use supplementation in order to hit that 5 grams per day threshold. Next on the list of foods that are beneficial for brain health is one that you've probably seen pictures of online, because there seems to be a practice of putting pictures of blueberries and other dark berries next to any title that says foods that benefit your brain. There are a lot of foods out there that have been purported to improve brain function. The interesting thing about blueberries and other berries, blackberries, dark currants, any of these thin-skinned berries that are purplish in color, is that they contain what are called anthocyanins. Anthocyanins actually have some really nice data to support the fact that they improve brain function. Now, whether or not it is direct effects on neurons, or whether or not it is by lowering inflammation, or some other modulatory effect isn't quite clear. But I think by now, there's enough data to support the fact that eating a cup or two of blueberries pretty often every day, or maybe you have blackberries, or maybe it's black currants, that these anthocyanins are good for us, that they are enhancing our overall well-being at a number of different levels. So we've got EPA fatty acids, we've got phosphatidylserine, we've got choline, we've got creatine, and we have the anthocyanins. And the last item that I'd like to place in this list of food-derived things that can enhance brain function is glutamine. Glutamine is a very interesting amino acid. I've talked about glutamine on here before. There's some evidence, although somewhat scant, there's some evidence that glutamine can enhance immune system function. So people will supplement with glutamine, or people can get glutamine from foods. Foods that contain a lot of glutamine are things like cottage cheese. There are also other sources of glutamine. Glutamine is rich in protein-rich foods. Things like beef, chicken, fish, dairy products, eggs, but also for you, non-animal food consuming people out there. Vegetables including beans, cabbage, once again, spinach, parsley, things of that sort. So those foods contain glutamine. For people that supplement with glutamine, generally they will take anywhere from a gram, as much as 10 grams per day. Why would they want to do that? Well, there's also some evidence starting to emerge that glutamine can help offset sugar cravings. In brief, we all have neurons in our gut that sense the amino acid content, the fat content, and the sugar content of the foods that we eat and signal in a subconscious way to our brain whether or not the foods that we are eating contain certain levels of certain amino acids. And so we actually have glutamine sensing neurons in our gut that actually have their little processes, their little axons and dendrites, as we call them, in the mucosal lining of the gut. They're not just sensing glutamine, but when they do sense glutamine, they respond and they send signals to the brain that are signals of satiation, of satisfaction. And in doing so, can offset some of the sugar cravings that many people suffer. So that more or less completes the list of things that, at least by my read of the literature, are things that are supported by at least 3. And in some cases, as many as hundreds of studies in various populations that have been explored in mouse studies often, but also in a number of human studies. I want to emphasize again that all of the things I listed out, whether or not it's EPA, whether or not it's phosphatidylserine, whether or not it's choline, whether or not it's the various compounds that are in berries, etc., all of those can be extracted from food. There's not any law that says that you have to get them from supplementation. Supplementation can help you get to the very high levels of those things. If you want to work on the higher end, if that's right for you, obviously check with your doctor before taking anything or removing anything from your diet or supplement regime. But in general, you can get these things from foods. It just so happens that for some of these compounds, the foods that they're contained in, like fish, are not foods that I particularly enjoy. And so I rely on supplements in order to get sufficient levels for me. But again, you can get these levels from food. And the reason I made this list, the reason that I emphasize these things in this particular order, is that they support the structure of neurons. They support the structure of the other cells of the brain that make up our cognition and that are important for our focus and our ability to remember things and so forth. And they are less so in the category of so-called modulatory effects. They will also have modulatory effects on sleep, on inflammation or reducing inflammation throughout the body, on cardiovascular function. All of which I believe are positive effects, at least what the literature tells us, is that none of these compounds are harming other systems of the body, provided they are taken at reasonable levels. But everything in this list is directed towards answering the question, what can I eat? What can I ingest by way of food and or food supplement that can support brain function in the short term and in the long term? So I hope you find that list beneficial for you, if not for use, at least for consideration. So now, having talked about some of the foods and micronutrients that are beneficial to our immediate and long-term brain health, I'd like to shift gears somewhat and talk about why it is that we like the foods that we like. We've all heard before that we are hardwired to pursue sugar and to like fatty foods, and that calorie-rich foods are attractive to us for all sorts of reasons, surviving famines and things of that sort. And while that is true, the actual mechanisms that underlie food seeking and food preference are far more interesting than that. There are basically 3 channels in our body and nervous system by which we decide what foods to pursue, how much to eat, and whether or not we will find a particular food attractive, whether or not we want to consume more of it, whether or not we want to avoid it, or whether or not it's just sort of, so what I refer to as the yuck, or meh analysis, and indeed that's what our nervous system is doing with respect to food. So let's talk about what these 3 channels for food preference are. The first one is an obvious one. It's taste on the mouth. It's taste on the mouth. It is the sensation that we have of the foods that we eat while we're chewing them. And those sensations, which are literally just sensory touch sensations. You know that the palatability of food as it relates to the consistency of food. That's important. And as you've all heard before, we have sensors on our tongue and elsewhere in our mouth that detect the various chemicals contained within food and lead to the senses of taste, which we call bitter, sweet, umami, salty, and sour. The umami receptor is a receptor that responds to the savory taste of things. So that's what you might find in a really wonderfully rich tomato sauce for those of you that eat meat and like a really well-cooked, not necessarily well done, but properly cooked, I should say, steak. If that's your thing, and umami is present in both plant and animal foods and gives us that sensation of savoriness. So we have those 5 basic tastes. Those are chemical sensors on the tongue that what we call transduce those chemicals. Those chemicals literally in food bind to those receptors. And it is transduced, meaning the binding of those chemicals to the receptors is converted into an electrical signal that travels in from the tongue along what's called the gustatory nerve. Then synapses, meaning it makes connections in our brainstem in the so-called nucleus of the solitary tract. There are other nuclei back there. Nuclei are just aggregates of neurons, and then it sends information up to the so-called insular cortex. The insular cortex is an incredible structure that we all have that mainly is concerned with so-called interoception, or our perception of what's going on inside our body. So it could be the amount of pressure in our gut because of how much food we've eaten. It could be the acidity of our gut if we're having a little bit of indigestion, for instance. And not surprisingly, the taste system sends information up to the insular cortex to give us a sense literally of what we've ingested, whether or not what we're tasting tastes good or not. What this means is that your perception of what you like is a central meaning deep within the brain phenomenon. It's not about how things taste on your mouth. But as we'll see in a few minutes, turns out that is not a direct relationship that is hardwired. You can actually uncouple the preference for particular tastes with the reward systems in the brain. It's actually possible to rewire one's sense of taste and preference for particular foods. But the most important thing to understand is that, like with our hearing, like with vision, like with smell, taste is an internal representation that has particular goals for you. Your sense of what tastes good is related to particular things that are occurring in your brain and body, and that are likely to give your brain and body the things that it needs. It is not simply a matter of what you quote unquote like, or what tastes good, or what doesn't taste good. Let me give you a relatively simple example of how your body and your brain are acting in a coordinated way to make you prefer certain foods and indeed to pursue certain foods more. So I just mentioned you have neurons on your tongue that respond to different tastes. But of course, your digestive tract isn't just your tongue, it's also your throat. Goes all the way down to your stomach and of course your intestines. Here's a long tube of digestion. All along that tube, there are neurons. Some of the neurons are responding to the mechanical size of whatever portion of the digestive tract it happens to be. So for instance, how distended or empty or full rather doesn't have to be distended. How depends on how much you ate, but how full or empty your gut happens to be. Whether or not something you just ate is temperature hot, is hot in the sense of hot to the touch, or whether or not it's spicy hot, whether or not it's spicy hot, whether or not it's kind of hard to swallow. So you have neurons all along your gut that are responding to the mechanics related to food and digestion, and that are related to the chemistry of food and digestion. There's a population of neurons, nerve cells in your gut that are exquisitely tuned to the chemistry of whatever it is in your gut. And these are neurons called neuropod cells. They respond to amino acids, sugars, and fatty acids. So as your food is digested, as food lands within your gut, neurons there are sensing what types of foods are available and what types of things are making their way through the gut environment. Good. And these particular neurons send electrical signals up into the brain through a little passage that we call the nous ganglia. The nous ganglia is a cluster of neurons that then go first send up their own process into the brain and trigger the release of dopamine, which is a molecule that inspires motivation, reward, and more seeking for whatever it is led to their activation. These are super interesting neurons because what they're essentially